Welcome back to the show. Today's deep dive is a little bit different. We're going full-on true crime mystery today. We're going to unpack a case that really kind of sits at the intersection of music and murder and technology, and I think it'll make you think. It's a fascinating case. Have you ever heard of the rapper Skinny Me?
The name rings a bell, but to be honest, it's been a while. Remind me who we're dealing with here.
Skinny Me was the stage name of a guy named Abbas Parker, a Philadelphia rapper, and he was actually convicted of murder back in 2019. And the reason this case is so fascinating is because his music, specifically his rap lyrics, ended up being a big part of the investigation. We're talking court documents, digital trails, you name it. You ready to kind of get into it?
I'm ready. Let's do it. Lay it on me. Who was the victim and what were the circumstances of the murder?
Okay, so it's September 11, 2017. It's evening in Philadelphia. And our victim, Sherman Williams, who was also a rapper, he's riding his scooter, and he gets gunned down. They said it was 6 shots, close range, fatal.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds like more than just a random act of violence. Was there any connection between Parker and Williams?
Well, they did know each other. And actually, some of Williams' Instagram posts included what you might call rap disses directed at Parker. And police actually found screenshots of these posts on Parker's cell phone, which, as you can imagine, ended up being a key piece of evidence in the case.
The digital age strikes again. Our phones really are extensions of ourselves. And in this case, maybe not in a good way, right? What else did they find on his phone?
Okay, so this is kind of interesting. It's almost like Parker created a digital breadcrumb trail leading right to him without realizing it. So the police found a photo of Williams standing outside his house, which Parker had saved on his phone just days before the murder. And they also found, and this is really interesting, a screenshot from Redfin, the real estate website, of Williams' house.
Oh, wow. That's chilling. I mean, that certainly seems to suggest that there was some premeditation, a targeted plan.
I know, right? And here's where it gets even more interesting. So after the murder, Parker releases 2 rap videos. One is called Bloodist, and the other is Notorious. And if you remember those Instagram rap disses that Williams posted, well, the lyrics in Bloodist actually seem to respond to those disses. And some of the lines are eerily similar to details from the murder.
Wait a minute, so you're saying the rap lyrics themselves were considered evidence? That's kind of crossing into a legally and ethically gray area, isn't it? How much weight did the lyrics actually have in the investigation?
A lot, as it turned out. So let me give you an example. In Bloodos, Parker raps, "Broad day I shoot, yeah, I take ya, I head Medusa."
Yeah.
Remember, the shooting happened in broad daylight. And Williams had dreadlocks.
Who cares? Yeah, I see the connection. But I mean,
Yeah.
Couldn't you argue that it's just like typical rap bravado, a stylized threat, not necessarily a confession?
You could.
Yeah.
But that's where the specificity of the details becomes really important. So in another line, he mentions his accomplice. He calls him Moss. Well, it turns out that Malik West, who was with Parker after the murder, his street name is Moss.
Okay, that's a little harder to dismiss as just a coincidence. It seems like it's more than just artistic expression at that point.
Right. And it goes even further. In the song, Parker boasts about an unsolved murder. And that aligns perfectly with the time frame of Williams' death. And then there's another line where he raps about using hollow point ammunition and shooting at close range. And guess what? Those details match the murder weapon and the witness testimony.
Wow, those are some pretty striking parallels. So you've got the cell phone data and the lyrics from Blood Ooze that built the case against Parker. You mentioned a second video earlier, Notorious. How did that one play into the investigation?
Yeah, Notorious is interesting. Because while the lyrics weren't used as evidence, the video itself actually became a very significant piece of the puzzle. We'll get into exactly why in a little bit, but first, let's talk about the eyewitness.
Yeah, there's someone who actually saw this shooting. Right. Tell me about them.
So the eyewitness, the guy who plays Parker at the scene of the crime, his name was Gregory Alston. And he described seeing Parker standing over Williams during the shooting, which is a pretty chilling detail, and it added a lot of weight to the prosecution's case.
Eyewitness testimony, I mean, that can be very powerful. But it's not always perfect, right? Was there anything about Alston's testimony, his account, that raised any questions?
There was one detail that I thought was particularly interesting. According to the court documents, Alston initially hesitated to positively identify Parker as the shooter.
He hesitated. Interesting. Was he just unsure about what he saw, what was going on there?
There definitely seemed to be some doubt in his mind. And here's where things get really interesting. So according to the court documents, Alston only really solidified his identification of Parker after the investigators showed him the notorious music video.
Wait a minute. Notorious. That's the one where you said the lyrics weren't even considered relevant. What was it about that video that swayed the eyewitness?
It's a question that makes you think about the power of visual imagery and the way it can shape memories. To really understand it, we need to dive into exactly what Alston saw in that video. And for that, we're going to move on to part 2 of our deep dive.
All right, so the notorious video, you were saying it ended up influencing the eyewitness's testimony, even though the lyrics themselves weren't about the murder. How'd that happen?
So this is where the story gets really, really fascinating. Remember we talked about the evidence the police had already found linking Parker to the crime, right? We had the cell phone data and the lyrics from Blood Ooze. But Alston's testimony, him being the eyewitness, that was crucial. They really needed him to place Parker at the scene of the murder.
Right, and he was initially hesitant to identify Parker. So what was it about that notorious video? What did he see that changed his mind?
Well, the court documents, they describe how the video shows Parker rapping and, moving around in a way that was really distinctive, like his gait, his posture, even some specific hand gestures. And those mannerisms, they matched the description that Alston had given of the shooter.
Hold on, so even though Notorious wasn't about the murder, the way Parker was moving in the video somehow backed up what the eyewitness remembered.
That's exactly what happened. It's almost as if Parker accidentally created a visual self-portrait of the suspect, even though he wasn't trying to. The prosecution used the video to basically strengthen Alston's identification. They argued that the video helped him solidify his memory of who the shooter was.
Man, that's wild. That really raises some questions, about memory and perception and how much visual media can affect that. I mean, could it be that seeing Parker in that video, rapping about violence, acting like a tough guy, did that subconsciously influence how Alston remembered what happened?
I think it's definitely possible. We know that eyewitness testimony can be tricky. Memory is a fragile thing, especially in high-stress situations, like when you witness a violent crime.
For sure. There's a whole field of study, on the psychology of eyewitness testimony. And the research is pretty clear. Our memories aren't like perfect video recordings. They can be influenced by so many things. Stress, bias, even being exposed to new information after the fact. Like, for example, watching a music video of the suspect.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes this case so complicated. You have this mix of digital evidence, rap lyrics, and eyewitness testimony that might have been swayed, at least a little bit, by the defendant's own art. It really makes you think.
It really does. And this case, it brings up the challenges that the justice system faces in this digital age. Everywhere we go, we're leaving these digital footprints. And those pieces of ourselves can be used in ways that we never even thought of.
Yeah, it's like a double-edged sword. Technology gives us all these ways to express ourselves, connect with people, but it also creates this permanent record. And that record can be analyzed, scrutinized, and potentially used against us.
Exactly. And this case is a perfect example of that. It brings up some really tough questions, like how do we balance free expression with holding people responsible for what they do? Where do we draw the line between art as a creative outlet and art as evidence?
Those are the kinds of questions that legal experts and ethicists have been wrestling with for years, and there are no easy answers. But this case really highlights how important it is to keep talking about this, to understand the complexities and potential problems of using digital evidence, especially when it comes to art.
I totally agree. And it's not just about the legal stuff. It's about society as a whole. If artists are always worried that their lyrics or performances will be seen as confessions, that could have a chilling effect on creativity.
Exactly. Imagine a world where artists are too scared to explore dark themes or controversial ideas or push the boundaries. That would really stifle innovation and limit the power of art. The art's power to challenge and provoke and inspire.
Absolutely. Art has always been about reflecting the human experience, good and bad. And while we definitely need to hold people accountable for their actions, we also need to protect spaces for creative expression, even when it makes us uncomfortable.
So what now? How do we navigate this complicated world where art and technology and the law all overlap?
Well, I think the first thing is awareness. Artists need to think about their digital footprint and the potential consequences of what they put out there. Law enforcement needs to be really careful about interpreting art as evidence. And we, as a society, we need to have open and honest conversations about this, about how art, technology, and justice all relate to each other.
Well put. This case has definitely given us a lot to think about. Abbas Parker, aka Skinny Me. It's such a fascinating story. It shows us how art and technology and law can come together in ways that are really unexpected and sometimes unsettling.
It makes us question our ideas about creativity and evidence, and even about what justice really means. It asks us, how do we protect artistic freedom while still holding people accountable? How do we make sure that our pursuit of justice is fair and balanced and based on solid evidence?
Those are questions that we as a society need to keep wrestling with. We encourage you to keep thinking critically about this, to keep asking those tough questions and engaging in these important discussions.
Yeah.
But you know what? There's one more thing I want to talk about before we wrap up this deep dive. It adds another layer of complexity to this whole case and really makes you question how reliable eyewitness testimony can be. We've talked about the digital trail, the lyrics, the eyewitness, and that notorious video. But there's one more piece of this puzzle, something that makes this case even more complicated.
Oh, really? I'm all ears. What is it?
It all goes back to Gregory Alston, the eyewitness. Remember, he wasn't sure about Parker at first and only really made up his mind after seeing the notorious video. Well, the court documents, they tell us a bit more of the story.
Okay, what do the documents say? What else was going on?
So it turns out that Alston didn't just see the video. The investigators, they also showed him a photo array, with Parker's picture and a few other guys.
Right, that's pretty standard, isn't it? You want to make sure the witness isn't swayed by only seeing one suspect, to avoid misidentification.
Exactly. But here's the thing. The documents say that when Alston first looked at those photos, he wasn't 100% certain. He kind of pointed at Parker's picture, but he said he couldn't be totally sure that was the shooter.
So even with the photo array, there was still some doubt in his mind. It makes you wonder what really convinced him in the end. Was it the video, or was it something else entirely?
That's the big question, right? We can't get inside Alston's head and know for sure. But it does raise some big questions about eyewitness testimony, how reliable it really is.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole case, it's like a textbook example of how complex and unreliable eyewitness testimony can be. Even with safeguards like the photo array, there's always the possibility of bias or suggestion. And you have to factor in how our memories work or don't work sometimes.
It really is a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Here we have a conviction that's based, at least in part, on an eyewitness who was influenced to some extent by the defendant's art. It blurs the lines between art, perception, and justice.
Definitely does. It shows how important it is to be really careful with all the evidence, especially when it comes to art, which is always open to interpretation.
In this case, it really makes me think about how important it is to do more research and make changes to how we handle eyewitness identification. We have to find ways to make those accounts more accurate, to reduce the risk of someone being wrongly convicted.
I couldn't agree more. This case reminds us that the justice system, while it aims to be fair, it's still run by humans. It can have the same weaknesses and biases as anything else. It needs to keep evolving and finding ways to be better.
Really well said. To everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has given you food for thought. The case of Abbas Parker, Skinny Me, it's fascinating, complicated, and it shows just how much art, technology, and the law are all intertwined.
It definitely makes you rethink your ideas about creativity, evidence, and what justice is. It pushes us to ask those tough questions. How do we protect artistic freedom while also making sure people are responsible for their actions? How do we ensure that our pursuit of justice is fair, balanced, and based on solid evidence?
Add questions to ponder. We encourage you to think critically about all of this. Keep those questions coming and keep having those important conversations.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another one. Until then, stay curious.